Okay, good evening everyone. The attendees are coming on quick and fast. I think we've got potentially 350 or more, it was at last count 350 or more registered for the webinar tonight. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for coming on board. We've got people from across the globe, which is also really inspiring to see as well. So I'm Suzy Green, I'm the CEO and founder of the Positivity Institute. Hopefully I'm assuming I've met some of you in Australia and in my travels overseas, but really lovely to meet everybody else, the new faces, and I hope you do continue to connect with us over time. And it's really my pleasure tonight to have this conversation, to have invited Doug Strycharczyk along from AQR tonight to have this conversation. For me right now, pretty much everything is resilience and mental toughness. So every single call I'm picking up, it's about resilience, and we're strongly focusing on the use of mental toughness as a really scientifically robust construct, and even more importantly for me, the development arm, the opportunities for development are really important. So yes, it's a hot topic right now, everybody, I think globally. So it's wonderful to have Doug, and I'm going to briefly introduce Doug and then let him introduce himself as well. So Doug and I were just positively reminiscing. That's a positive psychology intervention, actually, if you didn't know that. So we were positively reminiscing about when we first met in Kansas. I think I was a little like Dorothy, and there was a fantastic presentation by Doug and his colleague, Professor Peter Clough, who are the co-developers of the Mental Toughness suite of assessments, and wonderful presentation. And I saw the title Mental Toughness and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. Having conducted some fairly recent research at the time using a similar construct called cognitive hardiness, which had been around for a number of years. And I'd actually used that tool to look at the impact of coaching on resilience using cognitive hardiness. And Doug will probably, I'll leave it to him to explain the difference between cognitive hardiness and mental toughness. But as Doug and Peter were presenting, it became really clear to me, particularly, I guess, as Peter spoke. Peter Clough is a sports psychologist. So when he was introducing the concept, which Doug will in a moment do for you, I was sitting there as a clinical psychologist, is my background and profession. And it became really clear to me that everything that Peter was talking about, particularly in, as I mentioned, the development, the opportunities for development. So techniques like mindset techniques, like visualization, goal setting, anxiety management, I had been using extensively for years with clinical clients, and in the main anxiety disorders as well. Whereas Peter had been using them for elite athletes for peak performance. And so it became really clear to me that unless you were fortunate enough, and I say that tongue in cheek, to have been to see a clin psych, you may not have learned some of these skills. And, or if you were lucky enough to see a great sports psychologist or coach, or perhaps a great executive coach that may have introduced you to some of these concepts, that the majority of people in our communities, and I would argue to this day, still do not have these skills of resilience, well-being and performance, which for me are the triple whammy, I'm calling it. And so we had wholeheartedly embraced the construct of mental toughness. Of course, as a scientist practitioner, I did my due diligence on the tool. There's decades, I think, Doug, now, isn't there, of research across the globe. The tool, what I've been really impressed with, again, which Doug will talk to you about, is the ongoing commitment to research and development. And like any tool, they're never perfect, and there's always opportunities for development. And I've actually seen that happen in the lifetime that I've been involved with the MTQ. And again, I'll leave that for Doug to talk about. So yeah, so we've used it extensively for the last 8 or so years. Ideally as a proactive tool. So we take our training out to schools and workplaces to teach people these skills proactively for when the curveballs hit rather than reactively. So we've been doing that for a while, but right now I think people are, in many cases, I guess, a little reactive, having, as I said, the majority of people in the community not having an understanding of what resilience actually is, and then not being equipped to deal with the challenges that we're facing right now. So I think, Doug, hopefully you'll agree, bring it on. Mental toughness has arrived. It's been here for a while, but its time is now. So I'm going to hand over to you to tell us a little bit. Doug is, as I mentioned, the co-developer of the Mental Toughness suite of assessments. He is in partnership at AQR International. He's had a long history in the corporate business world, in operations and HR. But I'll hand over to you, Doug, to introduce yourself to the people on the call tonight.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Suzy. So I'm Doug Strycharczyk, and I had a very fortuitous meeting with Suzy in 2012 in Kansas. And it's interesting if we reflect on what was happening then and what was around at the time, just how times have changed. And it isn't just that COVID-19 has suddenly introduced a big shock to the system. There are other things that have obviously changed in that time. But Suzy, before I leave the Kansas connection, we think of you less as Dorothy, more like the Wizard of Oz, if you get my meaning. But right, so I've been involved with Professor Peter Clough for almost 30 years now. In fact, Peter used to work for AQR, and actually he's now returned to work for AQR again. But when he was here, he started talking about a concept that he thought was interesting. He was particularly interested in sports applications. And at first, I have to admit, we kind of paid lip service. We paid a little bit of attention to him. But as time went on, we began to realize that he was talking about something that was potentially fundamentally important, and we began to support his research. And his research established by, I'd say 1999, that he had understood what mental toughness was. Now, mental toughness is a concept that we think, most people think, has been around since about the 1950s. It goes back a long way beyond that. Those of you who know your Greek history will know of a philosopher called Plato. And Plato identified what he called his 4 virtues, which were fundamentally important for society's morality. And one of those virtues was fortitude. And if you look at this description of fortitude, it is exactly what we are talking about today when we talk about mental toughness. So it's a concept that has intrigued people for thousands of years. But it's only now that we begin to understand exactly what this means and what are the elements and what are the components of it. So, Suzy, it might be worth just moving on to the next slide. Oh, the one after that's the pizza image. Oh, I can't hear you, Suzy.
I forgot to unmute myself. So sorry about that. So we'll be doing an introduction of mental toughness. Doug will take us through the model fairly briefly and provide some examples of some latest research. And I was just saying to everyone on the call, if you'd like to put some questions through in the chat box, we'll come back to that and definitely address some of those questions in the second part of the webinar tonight. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, so what we see there is what we call our pizza image. So what Peter identified that by the year 2000 was that mental toughness had 4 constructs. Control, that's the extent to which you believe mentally that you control enough of your life and circumstances to do what you need. Commitment, this identifies the extent to which mentally you set goals for yourself and do what it takes to achieve those goals. But the notion of hardiness that Suzy spoke about earlier broadened this understanding of control and commitment, which is essentially describing resilience, into hardiness by adding challenge. And challenge is where you have the sense of seeing opportunity rather than threat in whatever occurs. But what Peter added was, I mean, it's a fairly obvious missing link. He was able to explain a lot, but he was not able to explain everything using those three constructs. And he hypothesized that the missing link was confidence. So now we have an understanding that mental toughness has four constructs. But what is mental toughness? I'm not going to use the technical definition right now, because the easiest way of understanding mental toughness is to say it describes our mental responses to events. It describes our mental responses to whatever happens to us. And if you think about the current context, we have had a huge shock to the system. And so we can see from our own responses that we have responded mentally to what's happened to COVID-19 and all the consequences of that in our own way, but so has everybody else. And what is really interesting is, why have people responded to a major shock in different ways? And they have. And the explanation for that can be found in the 8 factors which support the 4 constructs. And those 8 factors are shown on the pizza image. For control, there's a sense of life control and emotional control. For commitment, there's goal orientation, and we now call this achievement orientation. For challenge, there is risk orientation, or being prepared to try things, to stretch oneself, and learning from everything. And confidence, there's confidence in ability and interpersonal confidence. We now are able to dig down to a reasonable level to be able to deal with the complexity that is mental toughness, because there isn't, we might explain it a little bit later, but it's often not particularly useful to talk about somebody being mentally tough or mentally sensitive, because we're actually a mixture. Most of us are a mixture of mental toughness and mental sensitivity, and that mixture can be understood and explained at the level of the 8 factors. And that's what the research has, the most recent research has shown, and that's really opening up a whole pile of new opportunities. So if you like, in terms of the evolution of mental toughness, in the 1990s, we began to understand what mental toughness was. In the early 2000s, we were working predominantly around the 4 constructs. And as we get to 2020, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've managed to understand what those 8 factors are. The next direction for research is likely to be not so much to look at expanding the model further. We need to be able to use the model and see how it works and get feedback, particularly from practitioners. The next phase of research is likely to be looking at how do we develop mental toughness if we need to, or how do we support the mentally sensitive in being able to respond more positively, more mentally to whatever happens to them. So that's a very brief description of what mental toughness is. Right now, we're beginning to find that there are some really interesting directions beginning to emerge. So for instance, and we can look at this perhaps a little later, work at Queen's University Belfast is beginning to explain, through the use of the mental toughness concept, why some interventions work for some people but not for others, and why when people use interventions or show people how to develop the mental toughness, sometimes you might get an unintended consequence. And that will help to make a more complete approach to understanding and developing mental toughness.
I'd love to come back to that, Doug, because I know I find that research, that recent research, really intriguing, and I'm sure a lot of people on the call will tonight. But I guess, you know, just in your description of the 4C or the 8 subscales of mental toughness, for me, one of the strengths of the mental toughness model is that it's so user-friendly, and particularly when you're looking, and Doug, perhaps I know I have my own explanation of how resilience and mental toughness, how I see them as being similar but different. But when we've had numerous calls in the last 2 weeks around, oh, we need resilience training for our people, you know, to be able to unpack what we do refer to in the scientific literature, resilience is a multi-dimensional construct, which means it is quite unwieldy. There have been different approaches to it in terms of being a process and outcome. There's still a lot of debate going on right now. So to be able to use quite a discrete construct like mental toughness to unpack something big, people really appreciate that they can actually pull it apart and then reflect on those, the 4 C's and the 8 subscales, and, you know, whether they use the tool or even just looking at the model and having some sort of reflection to raise their self-awareness around which are their areas of strength, which we tend to come to first in, I guess, positive psychology, but what might be the areas for development. So for me, again, that's one of its strongest points is that, number one, it's got the science behind it, but number two, it's just a user-friendly model that people can so easily relate to and understand.
Thank you. And that's absolutely right, Suzy. I mean, what people will often say to us, why don't more people know about mental toughness? Well, actually, that growth of understanding is exploding. It is exponential at the moment, partly because people are looking for it and partly because we're getting better at telling people about it. But one of the early sort of obstacles, but it's not really an obstacle, were the academics. They didn't want us to say anything about it until they were really confident that they had the evidence for it. And in fact, what we now have, there's about 120 peer-reviewed independent research papers in academic journals which support the mental toughness concept. There isn't another psychometric measure anywhere that has got that level of academic support behind it. So, you know, we've adopted a kind of careful approach, but we wanted to make sure that we weren't introducing something that would be a fad or something that didn't stand close scrutiny. It does. There is a massive academic research.
Yeah, absolutely. And ongoing research, Doug. And
that's the most impressive thing about working with Peter, and some of you will have met John Perry. John Perry is a spectacular academic. There are now Costas Papageorgiou, there are people in Switzerland, in North America, carrying out research, but they're almost single-minded about moving the concept onwards. I mean, too often you find that a piece of research will be published, it'll establish something, but people don't necessarily move on from it, and they just keep recycling it for many, many years.
Yeah.
We've already, from day one, we've looked at the emotional control scale and we've improved it. We've added factors to the concept, and it's all in pursuit of really understanding this and in making sure that if we put this into the hands of practitioners who won't always go away and look at the research, that they can be confident that this really works. It's not the complete answer to every problem they're going to come across, but it's going to be a big part of the answer.
Exactly, Doug. And I think the other thing I mentioned before, that sometimes when we're, you know, I'm putting a proposal together and then the delivery, the organisations decide to not go with the full-on assessment for everybody, say, for example. And so we use the model in and of itself without the tool sometimes. But I do want to say, and I'd love your feedback on this, I know from experience, my own experience, and with many others, when you do your own self-assessment, even if you just we usually ask people, you know, score yourself on a scale of 1 to 10. We explain that it sits on a bell curve. What rating would you give yourself on the 8 subscales? And I'll go through what a high looks like, what a low. But consistently, when people actually do the assessment, they're often very surprised. And I guess that speaks to the strength of the psychometric, Doug, that it picks up things that, even though it's a self-report and has all the issues of a self-report, but sometimes people are quite surprised that they, in many cases, might come down a little lower than what they thought they should be.
No, absolutely. So what we have is a framework, which you can see in front of you. And the purpose of the psychometric measure, the Mtq Plus now, is that it helps you to make a better decision about people. I mean, the statistical tools. All psychometric measures are statistical tools. And so they talk about probabilities, not certainties.
Yeah.
And, you know, whatever your results, what we're indicating is what you might be, not what you definitely are. So it needs checking. But you're absolutely right, because what we've done some casual work, it's not been published, to look at how people assess mental toughness without the measure. And we find quite consistently they get it wrong. And the most common example is we will often ask a group of people, we'll give them a scenario and we'll say to them, which of the 4 C's do you think is the big factor here? And 75% will always say confidence.
Interesting.
And it's because confidence is the element of mental toughness most people are most familiar with. But actually the scenario, or there's a range of scenarios, are more often about control, commitment and challenge than they are about confidence. So it's very easy to misdiagnose without having some way of checking your diagnosis. And that's the real value of the mental toughness questionnaire.
Absolutely. And Doug, there's a range of measures. I'm wondering whether you can briefly just explain the differences between the assessments that are available right now.
Yeah, sure. So the most sophisticated measure is the Mtq Plus, which is very, very, very new. And that provides information on overall mental toughness, on the 4 constructs, and on the 8 factors. So it provides a mass of information, quite a lot of detailed information about the individual. And in the hands of a trained practitioner, it will deliver an awful lot of useful information that can be used in conjunction with a client. The precursor to that was the Mtq 48, and that had almost the same amount of information, but didn't give information about the factors that were associated with commitment and challenge. So that's delivery and achievement orientation, and risk and learning orientation. In many ways, the Mtq Plus is superseding the Mtq 48. What we do find, though, is that because the Mtq 48 is shorter, it's only 48 items, it's still popular in the academic world, in schools, because the Mtq Plus is 63 items long, can take 15 minutes to complete, and that's sometimes a very long questionnaire for young people to complete. Yeah. But below that, we have the Mtq 4Cs, which is a 24-item questionnaire, which provides information on overall mental toughness and the 4 Cs. And that is the measure that people are beginning to use for very large-scale applications. So it's predominantly been developed for organizational development. So because what you can do is, if you have a workforce of 1,000 people, you can get 1,000 people to complete it. It's all online, takes no more than 5 minutes to complete, but you can then analyze it in so many ways. You can analyze the profiles by department, by gender, by length of service, by age. You can get such a lot of rich information from quite a simple measure. And then, once you've understood something about the patterns of mental toughness and mental sensitivity in the organization, what we find is then people go to the Mtq Plus and say, right, I now know where I need to dig deeper. I'm going to use the Mtq Plus. Below that, we have a very, very simple but very reliable measure, which we call Mtq Lite. It's 11 items long, so it takes about 2 minutes to complete. But all it does is provide information about your overall level of mental toughness. It's predominantly used in research.
Definitely. And Doug, I know we said we'd come back to some of the questions, but I did sort of raise that question. And as I said, I have my own response to this, but how do you differentiate when people are talking about resilience versus mental toughness? What's your general response to that?
Well, if you look at the definition of resilience, and there is a strict definition. The problem with the word resilience is it means almost anything to all people. It's right. Become a Hoover term. You know, we talk about going to buy a Hoover, but we don't actually buy a Hoover, we buy a Dyson or whatever. So, but if you look at the strict definition, it is the ability to recover from an adverse situation. Now, that is down essentially to those 2 constructs, control and commitment, the 2 constructs that are at the top of the pizza image. What we're saying here is something adverse has happened, something negative has happened. I'm going to pick myself up, dust myself off, and I still think I can do it. That's control. And I'm still going to try to do what I was setting out to achieve. And that's commitment. But that response is essentially a passive response. It's me responding to something. What Suzanne Cabassa showed in her concept of hardiness is that some people would adopt a more proactive approach to an adverse situation. So for instance, they would see the opportunity in a crisis. They'd see the opportunity in a situation, even though it was going belly up. And that's when she introduced this notion of challenge. So some people were orientated to look at what's happening around them, and they'd have a much more positive approach. So if you like, and you can add to that confidence. So if you like, you can imagine a line across the middle of the pizza image. The top half of the pizza image is really describing true resilience. That's my ability to survive. The bottom half of the image is describing what we call positivity. These are the elements where you see, I can deal with this world and I want to deal with the world. And so those are bringing positivity. So if you like, mental toughness is bringing together positivity, seeing opportunity more so than the threat, together with resilience. And what that does is creates the opportunity to thrive even in adversity, not just survive.
Exactly. And that's, I guess, why it is, I guess, one of my favorites, because the challenge component for me is my favorite. And I know you said confidence together for you differentiates mental toughness from resilience, but for me it's specifically the challenge one, because if you think about resilience, as you said, there's an adversity, something happens to you, if you like, and it's how you ideally respond, but as you know, many people react and they bounce back. Whereas there's a whole body of research that's continuing around post-traumatic growth by Tedeschi and Calhoun were the first authors in this space, but it's growing research. And many of us know people like that. We know stories of people. I was actually very fortunate to meet, some of you may have heard of her, Janine Shepherd. She was an Australian Olympic athlete and was training, she was a cross-country skier, was training on a bike up in the Blue Mountains here in Australia, and was sideswiped and ended up in a spinal ward for 6 months and as a paraplegic. And coming out of that, it was another 6 months and she was flying a plane. Like, one of the most incredible stories. She's now a speaker, and she turned up at my resilience workshop once, and I said to her, "What are you doing here? You could be teaching this." But for her, I mean, in that case, she obviously did go through an adversity, but she just went like, bring it on. And she sought out challenges to continue to stretch and grow. So for me, mental toughness really is proactively seeking out experiences for the intent purpose of growth and development, rather than waiting for character building situations to occur, which they will. We all know we get them and we grow as humans and our character grows. But really to be able to proactively do that. And there's some great work coming out now. I've been mentioning it a lot this week by Scott Barry Kaufman, was a PhD student of Marty Seligman. He's just published his book Transcend, and he's been revisiting a lot of Maslow's work on self-actualization. And for me, this component in particular is about personal growth and development, that's the bit I love about it.
Oh, absolutely, Suzy. And I think there's a big connection between mental toughness and Maslow and the hierarchy of needs. But I love hearing you say that challenges, it's a bit like having children, isn't it? You're not supposed to have a favorite. But if I have a favorite construct, it is challenge, especially this learning orientation thing. And the significance of that from a conceptual perspective is, we know from work at the University of Western Ontario that about half of your mental toughness is determined genetically, but the other half is determined by through what you learn from your life experiences. Now, if you have a learning orientation, if you're a reflective type, you're going to learn a lot from what happens to you and you'll grow. if you're not a reflective type and you don't learn from your experiences, you're not going to grow. And we think here that this might be quite central to both understanding person's mental toughness and mental sensitivity, as well as to develop it. And it's got a very practical application, because if you're a coach or a trainer and you're working with a group of people, if they don't have a reasonable level of learning orientation, they're not going to approach what you do with them with a sufficiently positive frame in mind to get from your work what they need to get.
Interesting. And that capacity to the risk orientation, which on the pizza says stretching oneself, I mean, a lot of that has to do with the capacity to sit with discomfort, you know, to be able to feel the fear and do it anyway, as the famous Susan Jeffers book suggested as well.
You know, it's a very sort of ordinary level. It's, you know, in a school, you think about a pupil, the pupil will be doing a subject and they might be doing 7 or 8 or 10 subjects, and those are broken up into modules. So they do 4 modules on a topic, and then all of a sudden they have to change that to a new topic. And, you know, we have these little mini transitions in our life all the time. Well, if you don't welcome those, you're struggling. If you welcome those, and that's, you know, I'm prepared to see what happens, you're going to really thrive. And that's true in work. You know, we see it all the time in work. I'm being taken off one project, I'm being put onto another project. Hang on, I was just comfortable with this. I'm not sure I'm that excited about the next one. But if you are excited about it, well, you get into it.
Absolutely. It's that, I mean, we're in the VUCA world, aren't we, Doug? Volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And the greatest skill we could be giving our children right now, and obviously for us as adults too, is this capacity for psychological flexibility and agility, and to be able to sit with discomfort. And I know people have questions and I want to get to those, but most people are really curious about the model, but they also want to know, well, how do we develop it? So I mentioned some of the techniques that I used as a clinician and Peter used in elite sports, but you know, I might ask you, what are some of your thoughts on some of the development opportunities for mental toughness, Doug?
Well, the first thing is, and this is harping back to the use of the questionnaire, most people, whether they're mentally tough or mentally sensitive, aren't aware of those 8 factors in themselves. So simply creating self-awareness, I think, is the fundamental first step in development. And sometimes, well, not quite often, it's a development activity in its own right. I'm interested to see how often we use the mental toughness questionnaire and people say, I now understand why I'm responding the way I am. And moreover, they're comforted by the idea that they're not unusual in some way. Yeah. It's not just them, but there are other people who are like that. And once you begin to understand, well, okay, I can see that my emotional control is a factor here, people can often begin to work things out for themselves. And of course, if they've accepted it, they're a dream to work with if you're a coach or a trainer. So the concept in the questionnaire, I think, is an important component in development. But then you can move on to tools and techniques. And you're right, they come from the world of sport, they come from the clinical world, but they're actually the same tools and techniques. And the one thing they should all have in common is they're all experiential. So they cluster around 5 themes. We talk about positive thinking. The difficulty with positive thinking tools and techniques is the research shows they work, but they work much better with those who already think positively. It's a real challenge to work with people who don't think positively. There's visualization, and visualization is something, I mean, we don't have to learn how to visualize, we do it. We need to learn how to use visualization. The third one is the traditional anxiety control tools and techniques. They're generally about controlling breathing and muscular control, muscular relaxation, really. Goal setting, but we're not really talking about setting SMART goals. We're talking about showing people how to achieve a goal, so how to set a milestone. But the big one, and it still is the big one, is attentional control. Showing people how to focus better, and focus for longer. And so to avoid distraction, because distraction and stopping what you're doing and starting again, doing it all the time, is highly inefficient and highly stressful for the individual. So the tools and techniques all cluster around those 5 themes.
Yeah.
And there are lots of them. You can do search on Google and you'll find lots. The only thing we know is they all work, but they don't all work for all people, which kind of loops back to what we're now trying to investigate. Why is that?
Yeah, and Doug, I guess I wanted to ask you specifically around, I guess, the COVID situation, but some of the themes that were emerging. But just on that point, attentional control seems to be even more relevant right now when we're working at home and, you know, we've got family and homeschooling and being able to park things and block things out. So I'd say that's probably one of the skills that is really important right now.
Oh, but very much so. And particularly the way we have to, a lot of us have to work from home. We're finding, for instance, that we're having to become more project orientated. You know, I might have half a dozen things on at a time in the office, and I can manage my time to move from one to the other. But working remotely with other people, I have to work to a plan. And if I say to Tony, one of my colleagues, I will do something for you by the end of the day, I have to do it by the end of the day. In order to do it by the end of the day, I have to focus on it. You know, I don't have quite the kind of flexibility that I would have if I was sat in the office with all the team.
Exactly. So it's managing a lot of distractions right now too, isn't it? And
it is, yeah.
Absolutely. So Doug, when I asked you about what was sort of becoming quite, what was emerging, particularly around the COVID situation, you said that you saw 3 themes emerging. It'd be great if you could share those.
Well, that's it's really, really interesting what's happening, because like most people, for 2 or 3 weeks, the world just stopped. And it seemed to be all about toilet rolls and baked beans. That seemed to be the thing that everybody was focused on. And that's appropriate. People had to respond to attend to their short-term, their immediate needs, and to make sure that they had the food they needed, they had shelter and so on, and they had the security they needed to be able to think about other things. And about, I would say, 15 days ago, our emails and our social media connections with the world at large suddenly sprang into life, and it's gone again, that's gone exponential. We've got query after query, we've got potential orders from people that have just sprung from nowhere, but they all revolve around 3 themes. And the first one is linked to something you've already spoken about, Suzy. It's largely about the ability of leaders and managers to manage in the current situation. And what we think is happening is that people in leadership and management roles are generally more mentally tough than most people. But they're very rarely truly mentally tough. So they may have elements of mental sensitivity. Now, when you talk about the VUCA world and you look at the volatility, the uncertainty, the ambiguity, people in leadership and management roles are used to having a degree of control over what's happening around them. You have virtually no control. It's all happening to you. And some people are beginning to struggle with that, and quite openly struggle with that. And they're saying, you know, I've been a manager for 20 years. I think I've been a great manager. I just don't know what to do. I'm really struggling to cope with this. And I think it's the elements of mental sensitivity that most of us have anyway that are beginning to come to the fore. So we've got an awful lot of interest in what's happening to people in leadership and management roles. But the second area is the more caring employees, should I say, are very concerned about their employees. And they're either employees that they've sent to work from home, and people who work from home, some people like it and it suits them. Yeah. But an awful lot of people don't like working from home. They find it incredibly stressful. And in the UK, we are seeing a correlation between reported mental health and socialization and working from home. So we know that an awful lot of people find working from home a real struggle, especially if, as you alluded to earlier, if working from home meant working in a 2-bedroom flat with perhaps a partner and 3 kids running around. It's not a great environment. But we're also seeing people who are looking after frontline staff, carers, nurses, fire service operatives, the army, people who are still having to work, but are constantly being told they're at risk of getting COVID-19. And so there are other pressures coming on them. So a lot of people are beginning to feel the pressure, they feel the heat, and the more responsible employers are beginning to think about that. But the third area, which I find really interesting, is that, and it's a comparatively small number of employers, they're beginning to lift their heads and say, okay, things will be much better in 6 months' time. I want to start preparing for that. But one of the things I want to ensure is that when I get my people and my teams back together, that they're in the very best frame of mind to get going quickly, because we've got a lot of ground to recover. And we're finding a steadily increasing number of people who are looking at that, and they perfectly understand that the staff they've got are probably beginning to struggle in many ways, or a lot of them are, and when they get them back, they won't necessarily be ready to move at 100 miles an hour again. So those are the 3 themes that seem to be emerging.
Yeah, fantastic, Doug. Thank you. There have been some questions that have come through, and I know we wanted to finish by 7 o'clock tonight. So could I share some of those questions, Doug?
Of course.
Actually, the first question comes from a close colleague of ours, of both Doug and mine, Clive Leach, who I was very fortunate to meet here in Australia, but he's returned to the UK now. And Clive said that, can we assume that nurses, doctors and care workers have chosen to go into professions that are emotionally and physically demanding? Can we assume that they have a high degree of risk, even under normal conditions? Or would we assume one would assume a high sense of purpose and calling? Could we assume, therefore, that they'd score higher on mental toughness? Is there any research to support that?
Okay, there's an interesting assumption, Clive. And the first thing I've got to say is there isn't published research, but there is a lot of work. We've done a lot of work with in the health world, and Peter is actually doing some work specifically on nurses. What we find is when you look at large population of nurses, they're like the rest of us. They're normal people. They do have interests and they have particular motivations, but you get the same normal distribution curve and the same patterns of mental toughness. So they're not particularly more mentally tough than, say, the general population. And of course that has implications, because now that we have this 8-factor concept, what we understand is every single one of us will have a different pattern of profile within mental toughness. For some of us, the key issue might be life control. For others, it might be goal orientation. For others, it might be interpersonal confidence. So even though we might identify a group of, say, nurses who are more mentally sensitive and beginning to find it difficult to work in the current circumstance and the current time, their individual needs may well be different. And that is critically important. A one-size-fits-all approach will just not cut the mustard here. You'll only be able to hit the target with a comparatively few people. Understanding the individual needs of people in very high stress situation is fundamentally important.
Interesting. So Doug, someone has said, as a leadership, it's just jumped, there we go. As a leadership coach, I use a lot of content based on vulnerability and authenticity. How do you see that relating or translating to mental toughness?
Well, vulnerability, right, okay, so we look at vulnerability. Mentally sensitive people could, it depends on what you mean by vulnerability, it could be described as vulnerable. If you go around that Pete's image, life control, people who are mentally sensitive on life control are people who believe they do not control enough of their life to be able to get on, that things happen to them. That could be a source of vulnerability. If you look at emotional control, they're incapable of managing their own emotions. And the research is beginning to indicate they also pick up other people's emotions. So they may not be particularly disturbed by an event, but if people around them are disturbed by the event, they suddenly become disturbed by the event. So I can see a connection with vulnerability if we were to go around the mental toughness concept. The connection with authenticity is a really interesting one, because it depends on what you mean by authenticity. What we find is that people will either talk about being authentic to yourself or authentic towards other people. Well, if mental toughness is about self-awareness, there has to be a connection with authenticity, about understanding who you are, and from that, learning to be the best version of you that you can be.
Yeah, I would say definitely in that emotional, they connect quite nicely with emotional control. And as Doug, this often comes up a lot in training. So, you know, does a score of 10 mean that you don't show your emotions, or that you don't feel and you don't show your emotions, or does it mean that you do feel them and you can appropriately, I guess, depending on the context and the situation, share in a vulnerable way and in an authentic way how you're feeling? And particularly this is really important, as someone said, in a leadership role.
Yeah, so a high score on emotional control, being more mentally tough, doesn't mean that you don't feel emotions. In fact, the research shows that you are as likely to feel emotions as anybody else. It's about the ability to not reveal or to control how you reveal your emotions to others, how you manage to reveal your emotions to others. And of course, in some circumstances, it's going to be useful, maybe important to show how you're responding emotionally. In others, it's going to be important not to reveal that. And I'm minded to think of the BP crisis in the Gulf of Mexico, when the chief executive of BP was tracked down and he burst into tears. And that was a very, I suppose, authentic response. But for the employees in the organization, it was a very disturbing response.
Yeah, absolutely. Doug, there's so many, and to everybody on the call, thank you so much. There's so many questions. Unfortunately, I don't think in the time left we're going to get to all of them. I'm going to pick out a few that I think will be relevant to a lot of people, or the questions that they might be holding. Can an individual, they're jumping so quickly, can an individual overuse any of the 8 elements creating stress and burnout? And I love the conversations around the dark side of mental toughness. So maybe you might just want to comment briefly on that, Doug.
Oh, absolutely. So in the licensed user training programs, we do cover the potential downsides of being too mentally tough on each of those 8 factors. And if you think about it, it's not too difficult to work out what they might be. If it's delivery orientation, it might mean that you try to do too much. With goal orientation, you have too many goals. With stretching yourself, you might take too many risks. And if you go back to life control, which is about thinking you can control everything, and delivery orientation, well, if you think you can do everything and you're going to have a go at doing everything, you have a high risk of burnout. And in fact, the research shows, there's a really interesting piece of research from Dr. Fiona Earle that shows that very mentally tough people often do not recognize the warning signs of burnout.
Interesting.
And curiously, the mentally sensitive do. And that's an advantage for the mentally sensitive. We tend to think that the mentally sensitive always have been somehow disadvantaged. Well, I would say that's an advantage.
That's fantastic. There's a great question from Matt. Hello, Matt, on the call. Does traumatic experiences strengthen or weaken an individual's mental toughness? Is that dependent upon an individual's proclivity to mental toughness?
Oh, wow, that's a really good question, because we were talking about that yesterday, because I can't remember who was it. It was Goethe who said, "What doesn't kill you cures you."
The stronger needs to be. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not true. It does kill some people. And I mean, it's actually very relevant to the current situation, because what we know from some research in Switzerland is that when you look at the mentally tough and the mentally sensitive and put them into high pressure, stressful situations, the mentally tough deal better with those high pressure situations and they become more mentally tough. And the mentally sensitive become more mentally sensitive and do less well. So when you're in a very stressful situation, in a crisis like we are at the moment, one of the things that we are looking at is, what is the impact on people's mental toughness? So I was telling Suzy a little bit earlier that we're going to be going out very shortly to our partners and say, can we get a number of the people who completed the mental toughness questionnaire in 2019 to redo it again now, and there'll be no cost to that, and we'll be able to compare the responses. So normally we know that in tough times, the mentally tough become more mentally tough, and the mentally sensitive become more mentally sensitive. That is likely to happen here, but it may even polarize further. So it's the people in the middle that we need to understand better, the people who are balanced between mental toughness and mental sensitivity. Which way will they go?
Exactly. Doug, there's some people asking more about tools for developing toughness. I wanted to give a plug. I don't know whether the book's going to be updated, Doug, but the original book, Developing Mental Toughness, is still, in my mind, a great text for an introduction to the concept, and it has pretty much a chapter on each of those 5 key areas, Doug, doesn't it, in the book?
It does.
Yeah.
Yes. And it does, and it also talks about coaching as a way, because when you think about coaching is the perfect way to develop mental toughness. And of course, it's a very personal way of developing mental toughness. And for some situations, it can be an expensive way of developing mental toughness, but it is the perfect way of developing mental toughness.
Yeah, and you also have a development toolkit, which we're going to very soon have on our website available as well. But you have development toolkits you can actually purchase, Doug.
We do, and it contains about 40, just over 40 exercises in a cue card format. And so by that I mean you can see it describes what the exercise is, the origins of the exercise and why the exercise works, how to use the exercise, and then how to work with either individuals or groups to reflect and to pick out the learning from the exercise.
Yeah, fantastic. So Margie, who asked that question, said, how can you coach someone who's not a positive thinker to develop toughness? I guess I've got my own take on that, so I may not be in complete agreement with Doug. I've never been a big fan of positive thinking, and I think that's mainly come because people critique positive psychology as being positive thinking, you know, the secret, think positive and you'll have the perfect body or the perfect relationship. So we've, in coaching, tend to use performance thinking, so the types of mindsets or thoughts that are going to support, you know, functioning or performance, if you like. So there's decades of research in psychology around techniques that originally came out of therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. They're now used for the general public. ACT is now acceptance and commitment training. I myself have done a number of cognitive behavioural coaching studies, and we would argue that you can and you should be teaching these skills in schools, which is starting to happen. They're basic mindset skills that, as I said before, you wouldn't have learned unless you'd been to see a clinician or if you'd had a great sports coach. But these skills really should be taught to everyone. So you can absolutely work on your thinking skills. It's not about thinking positive all of the time. It's, from my perspective, it's about, and based on a lot of research around hope theory, optimism, some of Seligman's work, and you absolutely can work on developing more optimistic and hopeful thinking. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, and I broadly agree with you, Suzy, but one of the things that we find with people who are more mentally sensitive is if you do something with them, they are really looking for this hope that you're talking about, some sort of evidence that, I've tried this technique or approach 2 or 3 times, nothing seems to be happening. So they're more likely to give up. A mentally tough individual might continue a bit longer and then begin to see results. And I think one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at some of the exercises. For instance, you'll be familiar with the number grid exercise.
I love the number
We've
grid
turned
exercise.
we've turned that into an app, and we're about to publish it, which means that somebody will be able to complete the number grid, then do it again, but their scores will be saved and plotted on a graph.
Fantastic.
So even though the differences might not be great, they'll be able to see the improvement.
Absolutely.
And I think it's that kind of feedback. A lot of positive thinking tools and techniques don't have that ability to measure very slight differences.
Yeah,
and that's what helps to keep people going.
That's true, and that same applies to the anxiety management techniques that you mentioned, such as a diaphragmatic breathing. There's some, just because I've been running webinars on this topic, so I've been checking out. I have a Fitbit myself, which has a Relax app where you can, look at your heart rate. There's some wonderful heart rate variability tools out there right now. So exactly what you said, Doug, to be able to get that feedback and see that the intervention's actually working is then a positive reinforcement to keep using the technique. Yeah. Fantastic. So someone said, does mental toughness change with age? I think, did we cover that or not?
We did, and the answer is it does. On average, it grows very, very slightly. The evidence comes from a big study on 4,000 people between the ages of 18 and 65. But that's on average. So it doesn't mean to say everybody grows. Some people might develop it a lot, and some people might actually become more mentally sensitive as they get older. But on average, it grows.
It grows, absolutely. And Doug, a lot of people are saying, and this is probably a combination of a few of the questions as I've scanned through, there's a lot here. What can we actually do for people into the future? As you said, some of the leaders lifting their heads and framing for the future. What part do you see in mental toughness playing, or what can we actually do to support the development of mental toughness for people as a leader?
Wow, that's one hell of a question. That could easily form the subject for a conference. I mean, just a couple of headlines. In almost all of the work we do, whether it's in schools or in organizations, we make the biggest difference if we work with the people at the top. And that should make sense because the people at the top set the culture for the organization. So their mental toughness determines the mental toughness component of that culture, how mentally sensitive or mentally tough that culture is. But of course, hardly anybody assesses that or is self-aware about the implications of what they're doing to an organization or the culture they're developing. To be able to assess that and describe that, which is the value of the framework and the measure, helps a lot of senior leaders to do that. And whether it's, and it's true about everywhere we go. Mental toughness development has to start at the top because that's where the biggest influences come from. But sort of a broader perspective, it has to start in the education system.
Absolutely.
And, there's a great book by a guy called Paul Tough in North America. He's the education correspondent for the New York Times. That's a great name, by the way. I wish I thought of that.
Maybe we can start calling you Professor Tough.
Oh, yeah. I might change it to a hyphenated version, even tougher.
Even tougher.
And he says that some of the research shows that developing life skills, they're not particularly talking about mental toughness, but the most influential period is between the ages of 0 and 7. And in fact, the education system in most countries reduces that. It has a negative impact on the development of life skills because up to that point, young people tend to experiment, they tend to learn. If the parents are particularly supportive, they help them to learn. And you suddenly go to school and you're told to behave in a particular way. Sit there, do this, do that, stop doing this. And the opportunity for experimentation and learning becomes very structured and reduced.
We are seeing some changes particularly in the field of positive education, where I'm interested in. And so hopefully that's going to change, Doug, over time. And we are seeing these skills being proactively taught to children at a young age. which is my hope for the future as well. I just wanted to say, while I think about it, absolutely the leaders, we say the leaders as the levers, if you like, as a way to create this ripple effect as well. But what we've found by even running some brief webinars for staff, which doesn't have to be a costly endeavour,
No.
but you're introducing the model. So again, you're giving a framework, but you're providing a vocabulary, you're providing a literacy. So there's some great research happening at Melbourne University around wellbeing literacy and the power of introducing a literacy in schools to children and their parents. But for me, you are introducing, it's a literacy that can then be shared. It's a shared literacy within the organisation that people can, you know, relate to and connect on as well.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that, you know, I love collaborating with Peter Clough and Dr. John Perry, because they're not out and out academics. They are very academically orientated and they're brilliant researchers. But when we take what they have developed, I'm not necessarily showing you what they have developed in their language, because it would go over the heads of a lot of people. So we're almost interpreters. But
Yes,
we sit there and say, right, how can we change the language of this without losing its essence, but make it more accessible to practitioners and to the people that they practice with?
Yes.
And so we've set almost all of our materials, would you believe, to a reading age of 10.
That's right. That's
and so you'll find very few true psychological terms. You won't see many of the sort of 8-syllable terms that psychologists will frequently use in our work.
Exactly. And that's, I think, again, one of the benefits is it's got the rigor underpinning it, but it's the user friendliness of it. So I apologise that we can't get to all of the questions on here. If there's anything that's a burning question, please don't hesitate to email us at info@the-Positivity Institute. I'm happy to come back or ask Doug on some of his comments if I don't feel that I can answer it. I did want to mention we put out a resilience coaching package at rates that we've never offered them at before, and Doug has very kindly offered the MTQ Lite as part of that as well. So if you are interested in doing the MTQ Lite and we have only master's level coaches work with us. So if you'd like if you're interested, please don't hesitate to contact us. But thank you so much. I had a quick flick through. There's so many people that I do know, but a whole lot of new faces. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Doug, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. We could have just kept talking between the both of us. It could have gone.
I think so, Suzy. Yeah. No, thank you for inviting me, and I'd love to do it again sometime. So
absolutely, absolutely.
Perhaps we can talk a little bit less and let them ask a few more questions.
Yeah, we'll aim for that. But thank you, everybody, and have a good evening and take care of yourselves, and hope to see you into the future. Bye for now.
Yeah. Thank you all for your questions.